Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about forests and how important they are to the wildlife, to humans, and to help solve climate change. With my guest, Laurie Wayburn. She is president of Pacific Forest Trust. She has been a program officer with the United Nations Environment Program. She was formerly executive director of Point Blue, which was formerly the Point Reyes Bird Observatory. She has won many awards for her work in protecting the environment, including the Climate Leadership Award from the Environmental Protection Agency, the Kingsbury Brown Award from the Land Trust Alliance and Lincoln Institute of Land, and the James Irvine Foundation Leadership Award. She is a lifelong member of the Sierra Club and author of America's Private Forests. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be with you.
When we are talking about climate change, most people think about the need to change our energy, but yet forests, ecosystems are equally important to helping solve the climate change problem. Why is that?
Forest loss and degradation is the second largest source of CO2 emissions in the world. Unlike the energy sector or the transportation sector, where it's really a one-way street of emissions that goes from the tailpipe up or from the smokestack up, with forests, if you manage them to restore them as full forests, you can pull that CO2 back out of the atmosphere. And it's essential that we do that because even if you had a magic wand and you could stop all other emissions today, roughly 42% of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere today would still be there, and you'd be adding upwards of 20%, 17 to 20% of today's emissions into the atmosphere. So while people don't think of it as a core solution, it is. And there's no way that we'll address the climate crisis without engaging forests.
Your organization was a sponsor of legislation that included forests in the first economy-wide state-backed system to address climate change. What would that new law entail?
Well, what that did, and this is AB 32, California's landmark climate legislation, it incorporated the role of forests as a means to help reduce total emissions. And it did that through establishing a carbon offset program. So effectively, what it did was recognize the power of forests to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and hold it safely for the long term. And at the same time, it provided a mechanism to reduce emissions more quickly than could be done by a changeover in energy or transportation alone in the very near term. And it also was a price control mechanism because working with forests is very cost effective as opposed to, for example, transitioning over to a solar panel factory, energy being generated from solar as opposed to using gas-fired or coal-fired power plants. It's just much less expensive than having to make the capital investments that you do when you're transitioning in energy and transportation. So it had those multiple roles. It recognized the value of forests for reducing emissions by stopping forest loss and increasing sequestration by restoring forests and conserving them. It gave a near-term way to help pull emissions down quickly, and it provided a mechanism that reduced costs.
Can you explain this concept of a compliance grade system for offsets, which you think is necessary to make a difference for climate and for biodiversity?
Offsets are a form of pollution trading. The whole structure of that is that if you're going to allow a ton of carbon pollution that will be out there in the atmosphere for thousands of years, you need to have a high-quality offset that compensates for that. That's a net zero, right? So you want something that's really credible, that's really durable, and that third parties can verify. You want high quality. And you're talking about something that addresses climate change, not just carbon. One of the really critical issues that came out of the Glasgow conference on climate last year was that the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are linked. And we need to be able to do things that promote our adaptation and the survival of biodiversity at the same time. And that is why looking at carbon offsets in a climate context is so important, and not just looking at a carbon ton as if it were an individual item not connected to the overall world.
California also has a scoping plan, 30 by 30 goals, climate smart land strategy. Explain how forests are connected to that.
We are very fortunate to live in a state that recognizes that all of these things are linked. You know that famous phrase of John Muir's that everything in the universe is hitched to everything else. And California has some very forward-looking plans to address these crises. One is this every 5-year scoping plan, which is the roadmap for the Air Resources Board to help the state meet its carbon reduction and climate goals. The other is a plan that was released just recently called 30 by 30, which is how to protect 30% of biodiversity by 2030, and how to increase conservation to 30% of your land base and your waters by 2030. And then we also are in the middle of an historic drought. We are also recognizing that it isn't just forests that are part of the natural solutions to climate. It's also how we use our agricultural lands, how we work with our deserts and our wetlands, how we work with our oak woodlands and savannas. So that's where another major planning effort has been underway called Climate Smart Land Use Planning, because we recognize with climate change we are having unprecedented heat, unprecedented rainstorms, really weird weather whim-whams all the time, and they're impacting our built infrastructure in different ways too. So is it with fire. So we have to plan differently. All of those things are grounded, literally grounded, in how we manage our lands. And forests are very, very critical to that because they're the source of our water. They're the biggest way we can deal with reducing climate emissions. We've been having some very uncharacteristic fires in forests and other land areas. So how we manage our forests will really determine how well we can meet the goals of all of those plans.
Managing forests is very, very important to preserve and protect the resource. We've been talking about forests as part of the solution to the climate change problem, but I have always viewed forests as a beautiful place to get out of the city and enjoy, and see forests as very critical for biodiversity on this planet, for the ecosystems to be protected for the other creatures, the wildlife that is so important on this planet. And yet, forests traditionally have been viewed as a resource to cut the trees for lumber, to mine, to exploit practically everything that the forests offer. Can you explain why it's so critical that we maintain not only the wilderness parts of forests where human impact is minimal, but that we manage better those areas that humans do utilize some of those resources?
Forests in California really co-evolved with people in California. The indigenous people in California actually were significant managers of these forests. The forests that we see today were shaped by how Native Americans burned and planted. Our oak woodlands didn't occur by chance. They were maintained by fire and by planting. Our conifer forests were maintained by fire, intentionally set, in many cases, by Native Americans. So there actually is an enormous history of relationship, positive relationship, between people and forests. A key thing here is that it's really important for us to re-engage with forests as stewards. Frankly, we create more problems when we walk away than when we change our behavior about how we manage. So I think the challenge today, we have the science, we have the knowledge, we have the smarts, is to look at the forces that shaped these forests and start working with them as opposed to always fighting them.
I have recently interviewed numerous scientists who have written some excellent books that explain the importance of having fire in the forest, and that the concept of the Forest Service and Smokey the Bear saying no fires, we have to put them out, is actually worse for the forest than to allowing some of the low-density fires to occur.
That's absolutely right. We have a phrase at Pacific Forest Trust, which is, we have to learn how to dance with fire, not to always fight it. Fire is part of our state. It's part of all the western states. And frankly, it's a big part of forests throughout this country. The southeast, the lake states, all have very fire-dependent forest types and other ecosystems. But the notion of putting all fires out has actually led to only the biggest and the worst fires escaping. It will be by restoring a more low-intensity fire management program that we will reduce the conflicts that happen when fires get into the wildland-urban interface or, frankly, become urban, as they did in Santa Rosa.
There is so much to talk about regarding forests, and we'll do so with my guest, Laurie Wayburn, when we return in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Laurie Wayburn. She is president of the Pacific Forest Trust. Your organization actually is engaged in trying to conserve private forests as well as have better management of the public forests. Why do you think it is important to have landowners preserve some of their forests through partnerships with nonprofit organizations? And I know that your group has worked with families and others to protect their forests on their private land.
So forests are a landscape, and they exist regardless of whether we have property boundaries across them or not. They function a lot better when they function as a whole rather than when they're chopped up into very, very different management approaches across them. And forests in California and across the country are a real checkerboard of public and private and a mosaic within the private of people who have different objectives and who manage differently. But we need the forest to function as a whole for it to provide us with the water that we rely on. It provides the vast majority of the water that California has. And if we want them to be effective habitat for myriad wildlife and fish species. So you can't do that only with the public lands because they're often checkerboarded with private lands. They may be little islands within private lands, or there may be critical islands of private ownership in a larger public landscape. And many, many landowners want to conserve their lands for forever, frankly. Whether they're families or whether they're companies, they may be looking at this as a legacy they want to ensure.
I recently watched your Forest Fest where you honored a family called the Harts who have protected their private ranch for hopefully perpetuity. What other places have you worked to protect?
We have conserved over 300,000 acres in California and Oregon, and we focus our efforts in the Klamath Cascade region, which is a 10 million area in California and another couple million acres in Oregon as a contiguous sweep of diverse conifer forests. And then also in the Central Oregon coast region, we've also conserved about 30,000 acres in California's Redwood region. We really pioneered this concept called a working forest conservation easement that guides how forests are managed. It does more than stop development or subdivision. It actually changes how forests are managed to emphasize the forest and not simply the production of timber per se. And that's a model that's now national.
You've been active in protecting the Trinity River watershed and forests. Where is that river? How long is it? What are you protecting?
We are working in the Upper Trinity River watershed to protect an 11,000 acre forest that's right at the top of the watershed, cuts across the summit of Highway 3 and goes down the Trinity River towards Lewiston Reservoir. And it's an extraordinary property in terms of biodiversity. It will be a refuge under climate change because it is remaining cool and relatively wet. So lots of species will be moving into that area as their areas warm and dry. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change and where birds are nesting and feeding. They've moved upslope like 1,500 feet. So areas that are higher are actually really important for wildlife to move upslope as the valleys get hotter. And that's a project that we're doing to benefit a group called the Watershed Research and Training Center out of Hayfork. We'll convey the forest to them for them to manage for the benefit of the community up there. So it's really cool because it helps protect wildlife. It's a real biodiversity treasure spot, hotspot. It protects the headwaters of the Trinity, which is one of the key waters that is now funneled into the Sacramento for the state, and it benefits the local community too. So that's one project that's really engaging us right now. And another is a project of almost 8,000 acres on the side of Mount Shasta, where we've been building a connected, conserved corridor for wildlife to move from the McCloud water rivershed over to the Shasta. It's where we've worked with a number of families, like the Hart family, who've been on their property for 6 or 7 generations so far. We also work with companies to work with them to conserve and manage their lands for those forest values, those ecosystem values. So working with companies like the Campbell Group or Hancock Timber Resource Group. And we've got about 45,000 acres that we've done there that connect literally millions of acres.
Are public funds utilized in these efforts to preserve and protect private forests?
Yes. California and Oregon and actually states across the United States have public funding to help acquire something called a conservation easement. So a conservation easement is just like a road easement in the sense that it goes on a piece of property, but it stays with that property forever, and its purpose is to ensure that that forest remains as a forest forever. So it stops future development or future subdivision, and it can also guide how that forest is managed so that it always is productive, safe habitat for wildlife. It's a connecting corridor between public and other public lands. It functions as watershed. The state of California, the state of Oregon, the federal government provide funds to help acquire those conservation easements because they protect those public benefits of clean water and rich and abundant wildlife.
You've mentioned the importance of forests and watersheds. Let's detail that a little bit more, because the watershed is basically the landmass that holds the water under the ground, that goes into the rivers, that eventually people, whether not for agriculture or for cities, take that water. And you've worked extensively with the 5 watersheds that feed the Sacramento River, including one project in the Trinity River watershed that, again, feeds into the Sacramento River. So how is all this interrelated?
California has an amazing set of forests in the North State. There are literally 7 million acres across 8 counties that are the home to the 5 rivers that provide the vast majority of our drinking water. Comes into the Sacramento River, gets pumped all the way down to San Diego and Los Angeles. Los Angeles has somewhere around 40%, maybe a little bit less these days, maybe a little bit more, depending upon the Colorado River. Its water is actually coming from the far north state. And so one of the key things we're trying to do is help ensure that, in fact, the whole state understands and appreciates and therefore takes care of that North State watershed. What we've done is work with the state legislature and governor to enact laws that recognize the value of those watersheds to the water system and to designate a critical area for those. I think one of the most critical things that we can do at this point for water security is to restore and conserve our forests, because how you manage the forest deeply impacts how much water is released when and in what condition into the reservoirs and into the rivers.
Isn't that more important now since we have a drought? We haven't had enough rain. We haven't had enough snowpack in the high mountainous areas, especially in the Sierras, to feed into these rivers. And that means it's even more critical to maintain the water source?
You are absolutely right, Nancy. And if we do the right thing by the forest can do the right thing by us. Do you remember the big flood that hit the Oroville Dam and wiped it out in 2016? That's what happens when you have atmospheric rivers sitting on top of the Feather River watershed when it's in poor condition and it can't hold the water the way it should. When the forest is in good condition, it can slow flood intensity down, reduce it by 25 to 40%. In droughts, if you restore a bigger, older forest with fewer trees, but these big ones with big bark and big root systems and better spacing, you can actually increase the amount of water that comes into the Sacramento by some estimates over 3 trillion gallons a year. So when you think about it, the cheapest thing we could do for more water security is take care of the watershed. The proverbial taking care of the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Is there one watershed in the Pacific area, California, Oregon, Washington, more threatened than another?
They are pretty much all somewhat threatened, sometimes very severely. I wouldn't pick one out.
What about the trees? We know the redwoods have almost disappeared because they were severely cut. Down here in Southern California, we have chaparral forests. They don't look like the pine, cedar, oak forests of other parts of the state. The different kinds of trees. We also have one of the oldest trees in the world in California.
California has an amazing, amazing diversity of forest types. Actually, the single most diverse conifer forest in the world is in Northern California. That's the mixed conifer forest of the Klamath region, and we have an amazing diversity of oaks as well. Frankly, it's astounding what is here. And sometimes when you're really wealthy, you may not take all that good care of all that wealth because you don't see an end to it. And frankly, for California, we really need to take care of it because it is globally outstanding.
You have worked in many parts of the world with the United Nations Environment Program. You've seen ecosystems. You've seen forests elsewhere. Is anybody doing a better job than we are, or do we all need to learn from each other?
I think we all need to learn from each other. We can learn from the Germans about a long-term time horizon. Now, they were planting trees 600 years ago with the notion that they'd be harvesting them in 600 years. They really looked at that kind of all-age approach. That's a big thing to learn. In Scandinavia, learning about low-impact harvesting equipment so that you could work without destroying the soils. That's a really key thing to have learned. I think we can learn from a number of Asian countries as to working with the species that you have. Because when you take the Monterey pine and you take it and plant it in New Zealand, well, gosh, New Zealand already has its own amazing forest types, and those are going to do better under stress than bringing in a non-native. So there's all kinds of lessons that we can all learn from each other.
You practically grew up with the forest, the Sierras, because your father was president of the Sierra Club for many, many years. You have that love for protecting the environment. How do we establish that among young people who don't go out into the forest and see how important they are?
Well, you are absolutely right. I was blessed with having parents that gave me the gift of loving nature and spending time in nature, and I'm very grateful for that. I had the fortune to start the environmental education program in the San Francisco Public Schools, which worked with nature where it was and children where they were. And getting children out from very young ages, whether it's to the beach, whether it's to the park, whether it's on a field trip to a local farm, that will awaken our kind of innate love of nature and start that culture of care that we really need to encourage and provide the opportunity for children to flourish with. It's not just altruistic. We know from numerous studies that children do better, for example, on school tests when they have access to nature. Our health does better when we have sight of trees or when we're close to any form of nature. We know that walking in forests supports our immune system. We can be altruistic in our own self-interest as a people by introducing children to nature early and cultivating their interest in stewardship and at the same time giving them a healthier, better place in life.
You were formerly executive director of Point Blue, or the Point Reyes Bird Observatory. And I know Point Reyes is an important ecosystem. The Tule elk were reintroduced there, but now there's controversy over the fences that are there. It seems as though any area that is protected still has threats. How do we deal with that?
We deal with that by staying informed, active, and engaged. It's really critical for us to let the public land managers know when they're off base. It's also important to let them know when they do the right thing. One example is the controversy at Point Reyes National Seashore, where the current management decision is to favor the non-native cows over the native Tule elk that were reintroduced at some expense. The best thing that we can do is really stay on top of those issues and engage with management on those choices.
I wish we had time to talk about all the wonderful experiences one can have in all the different kinds of forests. You authored the book, America's Private Forests. There are many different projects. What areas are you specifically trying to preserve and protect right now?
What a great question. We have a very big vision for conserving and reweaving the 12 million acre forest which goes from Northern California into Southern Oregon. It is that most biodiverse conifer forest in the world, and amazingly enough, we have the opportunity right here, not in Alaska, but right here in California and Oregon, to have a 12 million acre swath of forest that provides us with those gifts of water, with the rich biodiversity. I mean, an amazing biodiversity. You could sit on the Siskiyou Crest, Nancy, in the spring and watch more butterflies going across than any other part of this country. So that area, which is, as I say, 10 million acres in California and 2 in Oregon, is our goal to have that conserved, well-managed, but a conserved, connected corridor for wildlife, for water, and frankly, for wonder.
Thank you so very much for loving and caring about our forests and trying to keep them there for all species, including humans, to utilize and to enjoy. Thank you for being my guest.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I hope to have a chance to do so again in the future.
Indeed. I have been speaking with Laurie Wayburn, who is president of the Pacific Forest Trust. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.